In the mid-1980s, while most Americans focused on everyday life, something extraordinary was unfolding far from public view. It was not happening on a battlefield, nor announced in any official speech. It took place in quiet meetings, coded communications, and decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that would later shake confidence in the very institutions meant to protect democracy. At the center of this story was a contradiction. A government publicly committed to strict laws, clear policies, and moral authority was quietly navigating a path that defied its own rules. What made this moment so unsettling was not only what was done, but how long it remained hidden. There were no immediate headlines. No urgent warnings. Only a growing gap between what the American people were told and what was actually happening. Money moved where it was not supposed to go. Agreements formed where none were officially allowed. And agencies tasked with national security began operating in a gray space that blurred the line between strategy and deception. Years later, when fragments of the truth finally surfaced, the public response was not instant outrage, but disbelief. How could something so complex, so carefully managed, exist without broader awareness? And more importantly, what does it mean when secrecy becomes policy? Tonight, we examine one of the most controversial episodes in modern U.S. history, not as a story of chaos, but as a lesson in power, accountability, and silence. This is the story of the Iran-Contra Affair, a moment when secrecy challenged the foundations of trust itself. To understand the Iran-Contra Affair, it is necessary to step back into the tense political and ideological climate of the late Cold War. By the early 1980s, the United States was deeply engaged in a global struggle defined not by direct confrontation, but by influence, ideology, and perception. The Cold War shaped nearly every foreign policy decision, framing the world as a chessboard where each move carried consequences far beyond national borders. In Washington, a renewed sense of urgency had taken hold. The Soviet Union was still viewed as a powerful adversary, and American leadership believed that any expansion of communist influence, no matter how distant, posed a threat to global stability in U.S. interests. This belief was not limited to Europe or Asia. It extended into Latin America and the Middle East, regions seen as strategically vital despite their internal complexities. At the same time, the United States faced growing legal and political constraints at home. Public trust in government had been shaken by earlier controversies, and Congress had taken steps to reassert oversight over intelligence agencies and military operations. New laws were designed to prevent unauthorized actions abroad, ensuring that covert operations would not bypass democratic accountability. These measures reflected a desire to restore balance between national security and transparency. One such area of concern was Central America. In Nicaragua, a leftist government known as the Sandinistas had come to power, alarming U.S. policymakers who feared the spread of Soviet-aligned influence in the Western Hemisphere. In response, opposition forces known as the Contras emerged, seeking to challenge the Sandinista government. While some officials viewed the Contras as a necessary counterweight, others questioned both their methods and the wisdom of American involvement. Congress ultimately imposed restrictions that limited or outright prohibited funding for the Contras. These decisions were not made lightly. Lawmakers debated constitutional authority, moral responsibility, and the long-term consequences of covert intervention. The result was a legal framework intended to draw clear boundaries around what could and could not be done in the name of national security. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, a separate crisis unfolded. Relations between the United States and Iran had deteriorated dramatically following the Iranian Revolution. Diplomatic ties were severed, and Iran was officially labeled an adversary. At the same time, American citizens were being held hostage by groups linked to regional instability, creating pressure within the U.S. government to find solutions, any solutions, that might secure their release. These two distant regions, Central America and the Middle East, might have seemed unrelated. Yet within the halls of power, they gradually became connected through a series of decisions driven by urgency, ideology, and secrecy. Officials began to explore unconventional pathways, attempting to reconcile strategic goals with legal barriers that stood firmly in the way. What made this period especially complex was the layered structure of decision-making. Policies were shaped not only by elected officials but also by advisors, intelligence operatives, and institutions operating with varying degrees of autonomy. The CIA, long accustomed to secrecy and deniability, found itself navigating a landscape where discretion often conflicted with accountability. This was not a moment defined by a single reckless choice. Rather, it was the result of accumulated decisions, each justified internally as temporary, necessary, or exceptional. Over time, these justifications formed a parallel system of action, one that existed alongside official policy but was rarely acknowledged in public discourse. The Iran-Contra Affair did not emerge from chaos. It grew out of structure, belief, and pressure. It reflected a government wrestling with its own limits, attempting to maintain influence while constrained by law and public scrutiny. The stage was set not for an accident, but for a collision between secrecy and democracy, intention and consequence. The Iran-Contra Affair did not begin with a single dramatic decision. Instead, it emerged gradually, shaped by a convergence of ideology, urgency, and institutional habit. In the early years of the Reagan administration, foreign policy was driven by a firm belief that American strength depended on decisive action, even when that action was constrained by law or public opinion. This mindset created an environment where unconventional solutions were not only considered, but encouraged. At the center of these early decisions was a small circle of policymakers and advisors who believed that existing restrictions limited the president's ability to act effectively on the world stage. They viewed congressional oversight not as a safeguard, but as an obstacle. Within this perspective, the role of intelligence agencies expanded beyond information gathering into active problem solving, often operating in the shadows of formal authority. The CIA had long experience working within ambiguous boundaries. Throughout the Cold War, it had conducted covert operations justified by national security concerns and protected by secrecy. This institutional culture played a crucial role in how the early stages of the Iran-Contra Affair unfolded. When traditional diplomatic or legislative paths were blocked, covert channels appeared not as extraordinary measures, but as familiar tools. In Central America, the situation in Nicaragua remained a focal point. U.S. officials feared that a left-leaning government could inspire similar movements throughout the region. Supporting the Contras became a symbolic stand against ideological expansion. Yet with Congress restricting funding, direct involvement was officially curtailed. This created a paradox: strong political will paired with legal prohibition. Rather than reassessing the strategy, certain officials began searching for alternative means. These early discussions were not framed as violations of law, but as temporary workarounds, short-term solutions to long-term geopolitical problems. The language used internally emphasized necessity and urgency, reinforcing the belief that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary actions. Simultaneously, the hostage situation involving American citizens in the Middle East exerted intense pressure on decision-makers. Families demanded answers. Media coverage intensified public concern. Quietly, discussions emerged around the possibility of engaging indirectly with Iran, despite its status as an adversary. The idea was controversial, but it offered hope that lives could be saved and influence regained. These early plans did not initially connect the Middle East and Central America. That connection formed later, as logistical challenges and financial constraints became apparent. What began as separate problems gradually merged into a single covert framework, linking arms transfers, intermediaries, and redirected funds. Each step built upon the last, creating momentum that became increasingly difficult to reverse. Crucially, many of these early actions were compartmentalized. Information was shared selectively, ensuring that no single individual had full visibility into the entire operation. This structure allowed participants to rationalize their involvement, believing they were contributing to a limited and controlled effort rather than a sweeping breach of policy. The beginnings of the Iran-Contra Affair were marked by confidence in expertise, confidence in secrecy, and confidence that outcomes would justify methods. Few involved anticipated the long-term consequences of these choices. At this stage, the operation was still viewed internally as manageable, reversible, and ultimately defensible. Yet beneath this confidence lay vulnerability. By operating outside established oversight, the system relied heavily on trust among a small group of individuals. Documentation was limited. Accountability was diffuse. What had begun as a strategic initiative slowly evolved into a fragile network of actions sustained by silence and assumption. This was the foundation upon which the Iran-Contra Affair was built, not sudden recklessness, but deliberate steps taken within a culture accustomed to secrecy. The beginning was quiet, methodical, and rationalized. And it set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the limits of power exercised without transparency. As the covert framework of the Iran-Contra operation took shape, silence became more than a byproduct of secrecy, it became an operating principle. This silence did not exist in isolation. It was reinforced by layers of bureaucracy, institutional habits, and a deeply ingrained belief that certain actions were too sensitive to be questioned openly. Over time, the absence of oversight was no longer an accident. It became systemic. Within government agencies, information moved vertically rather than horizontally. Decisions were compartmentalized, and communication was carefully restricted. Officials were briefed only on what they needed to know, and often no more. This structure ensured efficiency, but it also prevented meaningful accountability. When concerns arose, they were frequently redirected, minimized, or buried within procedural language that obscured responsibility. The CIA's role during this period reflected a broader pattern that had developed over decades. Intelligence agencies were accustomed to operating under a veil of deniability, protected by national security justifications and limited external scrutiny. This culture rewarded discretion and loyalty, while discouraging dissent. Questioning the legality or ethics of an operation was often framed as a lack of commitment rather than a necessary safeguard. At the executive level, ambiguity played a critical role. Orders were rarely explicit. Instead, guidance was often delivered through implication, tone, or informal conversation. This deliberate vagueness allowed decision-makers to maintain plausible distance from controversial actions while still benefiting from their outcomes. Responsibility became diffuse, spread across institutions rather than anchored to individuals. Congressional oversight, designed to serve as a check on executive power, struggled to function effectively under these conditions. Information provided to lawmakers was incomplete or delayed. Committees tasked with monitoring intelligence activities lacked access to the full picture, making informed intervention nearly impossible. In some cases, oversight mechanisms existed in name only, constrained by secrecy rules that limited their reach. This environment created a feedback loop. The more operations were concealed, the more concealment seemed necessary. Each undisclosed action increased the perceived risk of exposure, reinforcing the need for further silence. Ethical concerns, when acknowledged privately, were often postponed in favor of immediate strategic goals. The long-term implications were treated as secondary, abstract, or someone else's responsibility. Institutional loyalty further complicated matters. Individuals involved in the operation often believed they were protecting colleagues, agencies, or even the presidency itself by remaining silent. Speaking out was viewed as betrayal, not accountability. This mindset transformed silence into a moral obligation, reframing secrecy as patriotism rather than avoidance. Documentation was deliberately limited. Records that might clarify decision-making chains were sparse or fragmented. This absence was not merely administrative, it was strategic. Without clear documentation, assigning responsibility would later become exceedingly difficult. The system protected itself by erasing its own footprints. Ethical failure did not occur suddenly. It unfolded gradually, normalized through repetition. What once might have triggered alarm became routine. Each successful evasion of scrutiny reinforced the belief that the system could continue indefinitely without consequence. The lack of immediate fallout was interpreted as validation rather than warning. Perhaps most troubling was how legality became negotiable. Laws were not openly defied, they were reinterpreted, bypassed, or narrowly read to allow continued operation. Legal advisors, operating within constrained frameworks, provided interpretations that emphasized flexibility over restraint. This legal gray space became fertile ground for further expansion of covert activity. Silence also extended to the public narrative. Official statements were carefully crafted, technically accurate yet strategically incomplete. Denials were issued that avoided outright falsehoods while concealing critical truths. The public, lacking access to internal processes, had little reason to question these assurances, at least initially. In this way, systemic failure was not the result of one corrupt institution or malicious intent. It was the product of alignment between secrecy, bureaucracy, and belief. Each component reinforced the others, creating a structure resilient to internal challenge but vulnerable to eventual exposure. By the time cracks began to appear, silence had already done its work. It had protected decisions, shielded individuals, and delayed accountability. But it had also set the stage for a deeper reckoning. Because when silence is used as policy, its collapse is rarely quiet. Long after the covert operations ended, the Iran-Contra Affair continued to cast a shadow over American institutions. Its impact was not confined to the individuals directly involved, nor to the political moment in which it unfolded. Instead, it reshaped how secrecy, accountability, and power were understood within the U.S. government, and how the public perceived those concepts in relation to democracy itself. One of the most enduring consequences was the erosion of trust. For many Americans, the revelation that laws could be bypassed through informal networks and coded decisions challenged long-held assumptions about governance. The idea that checks and balances could be quietly neutralized created a sense of unease that lingered well beyond the initial disclosures. Trust, once questioned, proved difficult to restore. Within government agencies, the affair prompted internal reflection, though not always visible from the outside. Career officials were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about institutional culture. How had silence become normalized? Why had warning signs been ignored or dismissed? These questions did not yield simple answers, but they revealed systemic vulnerabilities that extended beyond a single scandal. The intelligence community, in particular, faced a reputational reckoning. While secrecy remained essential to national security, the affair highlighted the risks of unchecked discretion. Critics argue that when secrecy operates without robust oversight, it can drift from protection into self-preservation. This tension, between necessary confidentiality and democratic accountability, became a recurring theme in subsequent debates about intelligence reform. The legal system also felt the long shadow. The affair exposed limitations in how laws governing covert action were written and enforced. Ambiguities that had once been overlooked were now scrutinized, revealing gaps that could be exploited under pressure. Legal scholars and policymakers revisited assumptions about executive authority, seeking clearer boundaries that could withstand future crises. Beyond institutions, the social impact was subtle but significant. The affair contributed to a broader skepticism toward official narratives, reinforcing a growing public awareness that transparency was often partial and conditional. This skepticism did not always manifest as outrage. More often, it appeared as quiet doubt, a cautious distance between citizens and their government. Generationally, the Iran-Contra Affair became a reference point. For those who lived through it, it served as a reminder that democratic systems require constant vigilance. For younger generations, it entered history books as a case study in ethical complexity, illustrating how good intentions can coexist with problematic methods. Internationally, the episode influenced perceptions of American credibility. Allies and adversaries alike observed how internal contradictions played out on the global stage. The affair underscored the challenge of promoting democratic values abroad while struggling to uphold them consistently at home. Perhaps the most lasting shadow was psychological. Within the corridors of power, the memory of exposure altered behavior. Some officials became more cautious, others more adept at navigating gray areas. The lesson absorbed varied widely, but the awareness of scrutiny, however imperfect, remained. The Iran-Contra Affair did not end with clear resolution or universal consensus. Its legacy was fragmented, interpreted differently depending on perspective. Yet this ambiguity itself became part of its impact. It demonstrated that history is not always concluded by verdicts or reforms, but by the questions that persist afterward. In this way, the long shadow of Iran-Contra was not defined by a single outcome, but by its influence on how power is exercised, justified, and remembered. It lingered in policy debates, academic analysis, and public consciousness, quietly shaping the landscape long after the headlines faded. The exposure of the Iran-Contra affair did not arrive as a single, dramatic revelation. Instead, it unfolded gradually, through fragments of information that at first seemed disconnected. Small inconsistencies began to surface, details that did not align with official statements, reports that raised questions rather than answers. What initially appeared to be isolated irregularities soon revealed themselves as part of a much larger pattern. The first public indications emerged through investigative journalism. Reporters, working with limited access and cautious sources, began to piece together elements of a story that contradicted the government's public position. These early reports did not immediately command widespread attention. Their claims were complex, technical, and difficult to verify. Yet they introduced doubt, and doubt proved persistent. As additional information came to light, media coverage intensified. Major news organizations began dedicating resources to uncovering the full scope of the operation. The language shifted from speculation to inquiry. Questions were no longer confined to the margins of public discourse, they entered living rooms, workplaces, and political debates across the country. The narrative was no longer controlled solely by official statements. Government responses during this period were cautious and carefully framed. Initial denials focused on narrow interpretations of events, emphasizing technical accuracy while avoiding broader implications. Statements were issued that addressed specific allegations without acknowledging the underlying structure of the operation. This approach, while legally calculated, further fueled public skepticism. Congressional investigations soon followed. Hearings were convened to determine what had occurred and who had authorized it. These proceedings were notable not for dramatic confrontations, but for their methodical tone. Witnesses spoke carefully, often constrained by memory, classification, or legal advice. The complexity of the operation made clarity elusive, reinforcing the sense that the truth was layered and incomplete. Televised hearings brought the issue into sharp focus. For many Americans, this was the first time they witnessed senior officials discussing covert actions in a public forum. The contrast between the calm, procedural setting and the seriousness of the revelations was striking. Viewers were confronted not with chaos, but with bureaucracy, an image that underscored how extraordinary actions could occur within ordinary systems. Public reaction evolved over time. Initial confusion gave way to concern, then to debate. Some viewed the affair as a necessary, if flawed, response to geopolitical pressure. Others saw it as a clear violation of democratic principles. These differing interpretations reflected broader divisions about executive power, national security, and the limits of secrecy. Editorial pages filled with analysis and commentary. Legal experts weighed in on constitutional implications. Historians contextualized the affair within the broader Cold War framework. The conversation expanded beyond the specifics of the operation to encompass deeper questions about governance and accountability. The Iran-Contra affair became a lens through which Americans examined their relationship with power. International observers also took notice. Allies questioned the consistency of American policy, while adversaries scrutinized the internal contradictions revealed by the scandal. The exposure affected not only domestic trust, but also diplomatic credibility. The United States was forced to reconcile its public commitments with the realities now visible to the world. As investigations progressed, the accumulation of evidence made denial increasingly untenable. Official narratives adjusted, acknowledging certain actions while continuing to dispute interpretations. This incremental admission strategy prolonged the public reckoning, stretching it across months rather than resolving it quickly. The drawn-out process reinforced the perception of reluctance rather than transparency. The exposure phase of the Iran-Contra affair was defined not by shock, but by realization. The public did not awaken to a sudden betrayal, it gradually recognized the scale of what had occurred. This slow revelation allowed reflection to coexist with reaction, shaping a response that was thoughtful as much as it was critical. In the end, the public reaction was less about outrage and more about reckoning. Americans were confronted with evidence that the systems designed to prevent overreach could be bypassed through complexity and silence. The exposure forced a national conversation, one that did not end with the hearings, but continued to influence how power and secrecy were discussed long afterward. In the years following the public exposure of the Iran-Contra Affair, the United States entered a period of institutional reassessment. The scandal did not end with a single verdict or decisive conclusion. Instead, it initiated a slow and uneven process of reflection, reform, and reinterpretation, one that revealed both the strengths and limitations of democratic self-correction. Congressional investigations produced detailed reports outlining the sequence of events, decision-making structures, and failures of oversight that had allowed the operation to proceed. These findings did not simply assign blame, they exposed structural weaknesses within the system. Lawmakers confronted the reality that existing mechanisms for accountability had been insufficient when faced with coordinated secrecy and bureaucratic complexity. As a result, renewed attention was given to the role of oversight committees and the clarity of reporting requirements. Discussions focused on how intelligence activities could remain effective without undermining democratic safeguards. While reforms were proposed, their implementation reflected compromise rather than transformation. Incremental changes replaced sweeping overhaul, illustrating the difficulty of reforming institutions designed to operate discreetly. Within the executive branch, the affair prompted internal evaluations of procedure and communication. Agencies revisited protocols related to authorization, documentation, and interdepartmental coordination. The emphasis shifted toward clearer chains of responsibility, at least on paper. Yet the cultural habits that had enabled silence, deference, compartmentalization, and institutional loyalty proved more resistant to change. The legal consequences of the affair were complex and, in some cases, controversial. Proceedings against individuals involved unfolded over time, shaped by legal interpretation and procedural challenges. These outcomes generated debate about accountability at the highest levels of government. For some observers, the results demonstrated the resilience of the legal system. For others, they underscored its limitations when addressing actions cloaked in secrecy. Public discourse during this period reflected a mixture of fatigue and concern. While interest in the scandal gradually waned, the questions it raised did not disappear. Commentators and scholars continued to analyze its implications, often framing it as a cautionary tale rather than a resolved episode. The Iran-Contra Affair became a reference point in discussions about executive power, constitutional balance, and ethical governance. Educational institutions incorporated the affair into curricula on political science, law, and history. Students examined it not merely as a historical event, but as a case study in decision-making under pressure. The emphasis was less on individual fault and more on systemic dynamics, how good intentions, flawed assumptions, and structural incentives can converge to produce unintended consequences. Internationally, the aftermath influenced how American actions were interpreted abroad. Diplomatic relationships adjusted subtly, informed by a clearer understanding of the internal tensions within U.S. policymaking. The affair reinforced the perception that even established democracies grapple with contradictions between principle and practice. Perhaps the most enduring change occurred at the level of awareness. Policymakers became more conscious of the potential for scrutiny, recognizing that secrecy could no longer be assumed to remain hidden indefinitely. This awareness did not eliminate covert operations, but it altered the calculus surrounding them. The possibility of exposure became an implicit constraint, shaping future decisions. The aftermath of the Iran-Contra Affair did not deliver a definitive resolution. Instead, it left behind a layered legacy, one of partial reform, ongoing debate, and cautious adjustment. It demonstrated that democratic systems possess the capacity for self-examination, but also that such processes are gradual and imperfect. Ultimately, the changes that followed were less about rewriting rules and more about redefining expectations. the affair forced institutions and citizens alike to reconsider what accountability should look like in an era of global complexity and national security concerns. Its lessons were absorbed unevenly, but they endured, influencing how power would be exercised, and questioned, in the years to come. Decades after the Iran-Contra Affair first entered public consciousness, its relevance has not diminished. Instead, it has evolved. What was once viewed as a Cold War controversy has become a reference point for modern debates about power, secrecy, and democratic accountability. The passage of time has not softened its lessons, it has clarified them. At its core, the affair forces a fundamental question: how should a democracy balance national security with transparency? This question remains unresolved, not because it lacks importance, but because it reflects a tension embedded within democratic governance itself. Modern governments continue to operate in environments defined by uncertainty, urgency, and perceived threats. The temptation to act quickly, quietly, and decisively has not disappeared, it has intensified. Technological change has further complicated this balance. Information now moves faster than ever, yet decision-making structures often remain opaque. While the public has access to more data, the mechanisms through which power is exercised have grown increasingly complex. The Iran-Contra Affair reminds us that complexity can be used not only to manage risk, but also to obscure responsibility. In contemporary policy discussions, the language has changed, but the dilemmas remain familiar. Terms like classified, executive authority, and national interest continue to shape debates, just as they did decades ago. The affair serves as a historical mirror, reflecting how easily these concepts can be stretched when oversight weakens and urgency dominates deliberation. Ethically, the episode challenges simplistic narratives of intent versus outcome. Many of those involved believe they were acting in service of a greater good. Yet the affair demonstrates that ethical conviction, when unexamined, can become a liability. Modern governance increasingly emphasizes process over intention, recognizing that legitimacy arises not only from goals, but from how those goals are pursued. The role of oversight has become even more critical in this context. Legislative bodies, independent media, and civil institutions are now widely acknowledged as essential counterbalances to executive power. The Iran-Contra Affair illustrates what happens when these counterbalances are marginalized, not through overt defiance, but through procedural erosion and selective disclosure. Public trust, once lost, remains fragile. Surveys and studies conducted long after the affair suggest that skepticism toward official narratives persists across generations. This skepticism is not inherently destructive, it can serve as a safeguard against complacency. However, when trust erodes too far, it risks disengagement rather than accountability. The lesson here is not cynicism, but vigilance. Internationally, the affair continues to inform discussions about credibility and leadership. Democracies are often judged not by their ideals alone, but by their willingness to confront past contradictions. Acknowledgement, transparency, and institutional learning signal resilience. Silence, by contrast, invites doubt. The Iran-Contra Affair remains a case study in how internal actions shape external perception. In academic and professional settings, the affair is frequently revisited as an example of systemic failure rather than individual misconduct. This shift in perspective reflects a broader understanding of how organizations behave under pressure. It acknowledges that accountability must extend beyond individuals to include structures, incentives, and cultures. Perhaps most importantly, the affair underscores the necessity of memory. Historical reflection is not an exercise in assigning blame, but in preserving awareness. Democracies rely on collective memory to recognize patterns and prevent repetition. When episodes like Iran-Contra fade into obscurity, the conditions that allowed them to occur risk re-emerging. In a modern era defined by global uncertainty, evolving threats, and rapid decision-making, the Iran-Contra Affair offers a quiet warning. It suggests that the greatest risks often arise not from external enemies, but from internal assumptions that secrecy equals security, or that urgency excuses process. Reflection, then, becomes an act of responsibility. By revisiting this chapter of history, we are reminded that democratic strength lies not in perfection, but in the willingness to examine imperfection openly. The relevance of the Iran-Contra Affair endures because it speaks to a timeless challenge: how power is exercised, justified, and ultimately judged. The story of the Iran-Contra Affair does not conclude with a single sentence, verdict, or historical footnote. Instead, it lingers, quietly but persistently, as a reminder of how fragile democratic accountability can be when tested by secrecy, urgency, and belief. It is not a story of villains and heroes, but of systems, assumptions, and choices made in the shadows. What makes this episode enduring is not only what was done, but how it was justified. Decisions were framed as necessary, temporary, and exceptional. Yet history shows that exceptions, once normalized, have a way of redefining the rule itself. The Iran-Contra Affair reminds us that power rarely announces when it crosses a line. It does so gradually, often accompanied by reassurance rather than alarm. For the American public, this chapter serves as a quiet reckoning. It challenges the notion that democratic institutions function automatically, protected by structure alone. Instead, it reveals that accountability depends on constant attention, by lawmakers, journalists, and citizens alike. Oversight is not a guarantee, it is an ongoing effort. The individuals involved in the affair have faded into history, but the conditions that enabled it have not. Governments continue to face pressure to act swiftly in complex, uncertain environments. The language of national security still carries immense weight. The temptation to prioritize outcomes over process remains a recurring challenge. And yet, there is resilience in reflection. The fact that the Iran-Contra Affair is remembered, studied, and debated speaks to a democratic capacity for self-examination. History does not erase mistakes, but it offers context. It allows societies to recognize patterns, to question assumptions, and to resist the comfort of silence. This is why stories like this matter. Not because they undermine trust, but because they clarify it. Trust built on awareness is stronger than trust built on absence of information. The Iran-Contra Affair teaches that transparency, even when uncomfortable, is a form of strength. As time moves forward, the value of this history lies not in judgment, but in vigilance. It asks us to consider how decisions are made, who is empowered to make them, and what safeguards exist when secrecy becomes routine. These questions are not confined to the past, they belong to every generation. In remembering this episode, we are reminded that democracy is not defined by perfection, but by responsibility. By the willingness to confront difficult truths, to learn from complexity, and to recognize that silence, when left unchallenged, can shape history as powerfully as action. The Iran-Contra Affair remains a quiet warning, not of chaos, but of complacency. And in that warning lies its lasting significance.
Thank you for watching.